from Emanuel Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia, also called Secrets of Heaven, 4041. The heavenly form is amazing, completely surpassing all human intelligence, for it is far beyond and above ideas of forms which anyone can possibly get from the mundane, even with the help of analytical arguments. All heavenly communities are organized according to this form. And what is amazing is the gyrating flow of turning gyres, a movement of which angels and spirits are not sentient. It is like the flow of the planets, turning daily on their axes and orbiting yearly around the sun, which is not perceptible to their inhabitants.
I have been shown the nature of the heavenly form as it exists in the most intimate sphere. It was like the form taken by the churning circumvolutions which are visible in human brains. I was allowed to observe this flowing gyration clearly, and to do so for several days. From this, it became clear to me that brains have been formed in accordance with the flowing movement of the heavens.
Thank you. That's my favorite quote from the Arcana. And I intentionally am opening with something that's a theological, or from a theological text. And he never really gives up on the brain. I mean, he has quotes that are similar to this in TCR. So this is something that's all throughout his life. And I put together a little bit of a timeline that you can see that the first time he starts talking about neuroscience is when he's writing on tremulation, which is his first publication. And he writes to his brother-in-law, Dr. Eric Benzelius, that he had become thoroughly acquainted with the brain. And so there's this connection between brain function and vibration that's very, very important. And that's a lot what we're going to talk about. That it's really about movement, about physical forces, and there's a lot of kind of mathematical modeling that I'm going to get to. Right, so what are the brain books? So there's one that's called The Cerebrum, which is a light green book published by the Scientific Association. And that one is also known as the Venice Manuscript. And that's how I'm going to refer to it. And that was written while he was in Venice, started around 1738. Then there is a second brain book, which I will refer to as Codex 55. And this is the last third of it. And this has been translated once, pretty roughly, by E.E. Ulrich in 1925. But it was never published. And it's one of the things that I'm very interested in working with in the coming years. So I'm really interested in this book. And this book it's all kind of tangled up with the domain of the soul, or economia regni animalis, or economy of the animal kingdom, it's sometimes called. And there's a bunch of different parts in it, and they're all kind of, he was shifting stuff around. So it's not super clear exactly where things get caught up, because this stuff was never published during his lifetime. And so there's a lot of confusion, and I can go into it more, but about where all of these texts are and why a lot of them haven't seen the light of day. And so this is written in 1743 to 1745. So we're talking the period immediately before he launches into theological stuff, immediately before he starts working on the Arcana. And there's a lot of really good stuff in there, some of which I'm going to share. Okay, so where did Swedenborg learn about neuroscience? So this is from the introduction of the Economia. And one of the biggest differences that really strikes me the most about going from theological to pre-theological is his citations. And suddenly he's citing Eustachius, Reusch, Leeuwenhoek, Blonsky, and this whole list of people, and there are more. And when you go into the Venice Manuscript, what you're going to find is that large chunks of it are actually straight quotations from other people. So really, and one of the things that he's saying in here is that there are two different types of thinkers. There are data gatherers and there are data synthesizers. And so he's really saying that he sees himself as a data synthesizer, and he has a lot of kind of intellectual stuff that he very much owes to this larger scientific community that he was involved in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. All right, so where did Swedenborg learn neuroanatomy? So let's look at some of the things that he would have been looking at. Warning, there's an autopsy picture ahead. So if you're squeamish, avert your eyes. This is a brain, as it looks when it is surgically removed from a skull during an autopsy. And you can see, well, you can't really see very well in this one because this is very carefully removed, but the cortex basically has the texture of silken tofu. So if you just take, where is it? If I were just to take a brain, like this one.
Like hers?
Yeah. And if I was to, if this wasn't plastic, and I was to kind of plop it like this, it would all go splat. And so that actually becomes a really big problem for people who want to study it. So there are lots of techniques for how do you preserve this very complicated and fragile structure. And corrosion casting is something that Swedenborg describes a lot. And so when he's talking about this interaction between the blood and the spirit, between these two shapes within the brain, which is something he goes on a lot about, he's looking at this kind of an image, and this is from Body Worlds. But basically what you do is you take a brain and you turn it upside down, and you get one of the large arteries that's running through this area, and you fill it with, they used wax, but I think this is probably plastic. And then because the cortex itself is so soft, what you can do is fill up all those blood vessels and wash away everything that's extra. And so you're just left with this kind of skeletal form. Huh. And Swedenborg was very aware that the places where the blood vessels were going was important. That blood supply to different areas was going to be important to which areas had more cognitive capacity. And this is kind of the type of images he would have been looking at and the type of work that he would have been doing to get to those conclusions. Words? Okay, so these are the kinds of imagery that he was looking at. And if you look at the brain book, you'll see that there's a large volume and a small volume. This is the Venice Manuscript that the Scientific Association publishes. And the smaller manuscript is actually all plates. And you get these kind of plates because there weren't that many of them, but there were a couple of artists that ended up disseminating this stuff very widely. And so you can see how, as time is progressing from the 1500s through the 1600s, these are getting a little bit more accurate as surgical techniques are getting better and better, until you get to this guy Thomas Willis, who was a neuroanatomist who published a large work which Swedenborg had in his library, and he was able to produce some of the most accurate images of neuroanatomy at his time. And this is something that Swedenborg worked from very, very heavily. And you can see that this is the 1500s version, and this is the 1700s version. And really, the olfactory bulbs on this one are pointed out to the side, which is not where your nose is. And with this one, he was able to maintain all of this complex anatomy in this central area, including something that some of you might know called the Arch of Willis. And this is Willis. Cool? Something else that Swedenborg did a lot of is he studied the brains of different types of animals. And so he would look at Insects, birds, and elephants is what I have up here, but he also describes notes that he took from observing canine vivisection, which is not nice, but it's in there. And so he really gets this idea that the shape of an animal's body has something to do with the shape of their brain. And that's a really, really important idea, and I'm going to get to why that's so important later. All right. So popular pre-Swedenborg, people used Rene Descartes as kind of the guy. This is what he says about the brain. It is not the figures imprinted on the external sense organs or on the internal surface of the brain, which should be taken to be ideas, but only those which are traced in the spirits on the surface of the pineal gland, where the seat of the imagination and the common sense is located. So your pineal gland is not actually on this, but it's back here, kind of near underneath the back of your corpus callosum, and it's the geometric center of the brain. So when you move your head like this, it's the thing that doesn't move, right? Because it's the geometric center of consciousness.
What is the geometric center?
The pineal gland.
Pineal gland.
And Descartes was all about the pineal gland. And so this idea of a seat of the soul is really more of a Cartesian idea than a Swedenborgian idea. Because for Swedenborg, his big thing was like, no, it's not just one spot. There is something about the action of the movement of the cortex, and the cortex itself, and the movement of energy within the cortex, which animates consciousness. And so this is the anima. And this is the whole kind of idea behind the anima, and it's something that seems a little bit obvious to a modern audience, but really he was the first person saying this, that it is about the actual brain itself. Okay, so he has two kind of conflicting ideas. Can I get somebody to read these?
The Swedenborgian approach. Sensations do not ascend to any special glands or glandular conjunctions in the cerebrum, but to the entire cortex, so that there is no cortical gland in the whole cerebrum that does not become a participant in every sensation and in its least moment, degree, and difference.
Right. Point A. Can I get someone to read the other one?
Wherever cortical substances are most utterly distant and most greatly expanded, their sensations must be more perfect and more distinct. The reason why it is the cerebrum which sensates, perceives, and understands, and not the cerebellum, is because in the cerebrum, the cortical gland cells, being so many little internal sensories, are in a state to receive modes distinctly.
Right. Okay. So this idea of modes is something that's really important. And the idea that vibrations affect surfaces in terms of modes. I'm going to have some images, but I just want you to keep that in your mind, that it's about the variety of anatomy being receptive to modes. And so there's this kind of conflict between whether it's about the whole brain or whether it's about specific parts of the brain. And he's really suggesting that it's something in between. It's about this interaction and the level of receptivity that parts of the brain have to the whole. And this is kind of an idea that gets brought up in his theology with kind of distinctness and unity. And that this is a property of the brain, that it is both distinct and unified. Questions? I have some more images. Okay. Right. So a normal mode. So this is a very, very simple example of a vibratory mode. And this is really, I think, a really central, there's two kind of ideas that I want to bring up that are really central to how he thinks of the brain. And the one is that you have the brain as a system which vibrates according to these specific tremulatory cymatic patterns. and I'm going to have more images of this later, but you can think of the way that a glass of water moves when you vibrate it, or sand on a plate. And that there are patterns which show up when you introduce a vibration into a unified system. And this is something that he was talking about in Tremulations, but really becomes a lot more sophisticated with computers in the 20th century. So this is about as simple as you get, but you can actually kind of take the central line and think about the inside parts of the brain and the outside parts of the brain as interacting with a similar type of geometry if it was sitting along that central axis. Another really important idea to him, I messed up my slides. All right, there's another important idea coming up, but I forgot the order. I want to introduce you to this guy, Cory Bradford-Watts, who was a neuroanatomist of the early 20th century. And this was kind of the way that most people thought of the brain for most of the 20th century, was in terms of these Brodmann areas. And there are 52 of them. And it's basically this mosaic, and this is an idea of the brain as modular rather than modal. And so it's basically, there are different modules, and they do specific things. And there's some truth to this, but I think what we get from the Swedenborgian approach is that it's not about the individual areas, it's about how the individual areas are receptive to the state of the whole brain. So I wanted to pull him in because he's really kind of how we've been taught as a culture to think about the brain in the last century. Okay, so how do we study the brain in 2019? This is an MRI. This is me, and we now have the ability to look at a brain in situ. Look at a brain when it's living. And this allows us to have a lot more kind of scientific analytical complexity and accuracy than they had 200 years ago. So we can take a lot of these ideas that Swedenborg had and apply them in much more direct and analytical ways. We also have something called white matter tractography. Isn't this beautiful?
Yeah.
So these are signals, and the colors represent the strength of the signal, and just moving through the cortex, and you can see how there really is this vertical circumvoluting flow of these fractal forms, and this is something that you can see just by taking apart a brain. Like this isn't that, like the gross anatomy is pretty obvious, but the way that the signals move is something that you need a higher level of technology to understand, but it's something that he intuited from interoception, which I think is really cool, and it is why I have this assignment for you guys to practice that faculty in yourself.
What sort of diagnostics is that used for, and is that a PET scan?
It's not a PET scan, it's white matter tractography. Parkinson's, and there are a couple of other diseases which specifically affect white matter, but Parkinson's is kind of the big one, but I think epilepsy, and also, so this specifically is from a project called the Human Connectome Project, which is doing exactly that. It's an attempt to map the human connectome, and I have a bunch of images from them. But a lot of their work is just kind of generating the best images of the brain that they can create, which is awesome, and their website is great, and it's on your handout. This is from BC Lab, and this is called the glass brain model. So this is a type of imaging that you can do of a living person which not only shows the external topological cortex, but it also shows the signaling inside it and how those things interact. And there's a lot of, going back to Swedenborg, it goes back and back and back again to this relationship between what's happening out here in the neocortex and what's happening in the medulla, and how do the internals and the externals of the brain relate to each other. And so for Swedenborg, this becomes the internals and externals of the mind, which is something that I really want you to think about. Okay, so that's kind of the macro view of the brain, but what about the micro view of the brain? Because this object has 89 billion neurons and trillions of connections. And so we have to be able to switch scales when we're thinking about it. You have to be able to think of it in terms of large-scale holistic mechanics, and we have to be able to think about it in a very, very small scale. Can I get somebody to read this?
Sure. From macro to micro, Swedenborg didn't have a microscope powerful enough to see individual brain cells, but he theorized about them. Although in view of their ultimate purity, the arterial stamens within the vital substance of the cerebrum infinitely flee the most acute sight, but nevertheless transmit thither the most highly spirituous breaths and vapors of the blood. Yet reason must not be denied from advancing further, and from inferring on the basis of given facts and phenomena that the mode of insinuation is affected by a power implanted in their spiral contortion. That is to say, that when they animate, these most highly pure organs twist and untwist in the manner of a helix, and thus invite to themselves the pure essences of the blood, and express the same into the fibers. It is somewhat in this way that the form of the cerebrum makes its sinuous churning, for in this way do the serpentine convolutions wind.
Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, so there's this idea of the macro spiral, the big spiral, and the little spiral. And I'm going to show you some really cool images. Okay, so this is the one that I thought was earlier. But so the brain is a standard vibrating mode, and the brain is also a fractal. And this gets into this idea of degrees, that you can have a larger thing and then a smaller iteration of it and a smaller iteration of it and a smaller iteration of it. So as we go down in scale, thinking about the brain as a fractal, we're going to see the same images and the same geometry expressed over and over and over again. So this is just the definition of a fractal from Wikipedia. So it's a way of modeling a complex system. So a lot of the ways that he talks about the brains are actually ways of mathematically modeling the energy motion of the brain, and therefore consciousness. It is a very, very, very simple fractal that's just built on the principle of you have a triangle, and then every triangle has another triangle, and then every triangle has another triangle. So you get triangles existing at different scales, moving infinitely inward. And I just want you to keep this idea in your head. All right, so this is Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology. And he is also the inventor of the first microscope. And Swedenborg implies that he kind of engineered his own kind of microscope, but it would have been probably similar to this one. And you can see that it's not terribly sophisticated. It's basically a pin with a lens. And this little hole at the very top is the lens that you would look through, and then you hold it on the pin like that. So it's not super accurate. This is what one of the most powerful electron microscopes on the planet sees when it looks at the human brain. Or no, this is a mouse brain. I'm very sorry. When it looks at the mammalian cortex. And this is also from the Human Connectome Project, from Argonne National Laboratory. And this is like, it's like 5 microns, I think. This is extremely small. And it's about as small as we can get. And you can see, you can learn a lot from this picture. So the larger structures that are kind of the branching structures that are going across are neurons. And the smaller cells, and the smaller structures are glia, which are interneurons, which could be like 50 to 80% of the brain, we're not sure. But you have these two systems, and you can think of it a little bit like branches and leaves on a tree, where the glial cells are space in between that receive the electrical signals from the neurons and help them communicate. And glial cells are really interesting, and I could talk about them for hours. So if you care, that's an option. I do.
Say something about them.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have neurons and you have glial cells, and I think the most important thing about glial cells is that they are very important for learning, and about 70% of them change every day.
Wow.
Oh,
Wow.
So they're the seat of plasticity, and they're the seat of a lot about what makes us human, because the way that we encode things like syntax has to do with how our glial cells are arranged. They're also, because they don't have this electrical signaling in them the same way that neurons do, they are a lot softer and a lot more flexible. And yeah, they're kind of an amazing part of the brain that has been ignored a lot because they don't have these electrical signals. So it's a lot harder to kind of understand and to research them because they are smaller than neurons, and they behave in a very different way. But it's a very important part of our brain, and a very important part of kind of our day-to-day experience of consciousness.
Oh, brain cancers, is that one of the most common ones?
I'm not a pathologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm an artist. And so I don't know a lot about brain cancer. What I do know is that there's astrocytomas, which involve astrocytes, but most of the brain-oriented cancers, as far as I know, aren't. They aren't like directly affecting. They don't usually directly affect the brain tissue. They usually affect something around the brain tissue. But again, I'm an artist, not a doctor. Okay, so if we go from this scale and jump to a scale smaller, as Swedenborg suggests, what we cannot see with our eyes, we should pursue with our intellect. And so that gets me to this idea of microtubules and the Hammerhoff-Penrose hypothesis, which is a quantum physical theory which came out in the late 90s and has had a little bit of, has been questioned since then, but I still think it's a really solid way of thinking. And basically, what they're saying is there are these things called microtubules, which look like this. And I had a really nice stick of lavender when I did this talk earlier, which I totally forgot to bring. But you can imagine a tree growing, and these sort of Fibonacci growth principles that show up in nature. And basically this hypothesis is saying that because these microtubules have this helical form, they are able to transmit vibrations and energy vibrations in a way which encourages quantum entanglement. And so if you replace the quantum unified field discourse with a theological discourse, I think you get kind of the same idea that Swedenborg is describing. And I think it's really just two different metaphors that you can use for what I think is the same phenomenon. All right, any questions?
So what's the phenomenon that those metaphors describe?
The function of the brain, and the physical function of our consciousness, and the quantum physical structure of our consciousness. And really, like, what this opened up to me was a new way of reading the more theological stuff that's about kind of how can I experience myself here and now as a spiritual being without having to leap to something that I couldn't quite follow, and how do I get to that intuitive spiritual consciousness through the path of my senses. And I don't think that's right for everyone, but it really has worked out well for me. And I think the science is there for those who are interested.
Yeah, I always thought it was funny that we know there's bacteria in the ocean that manipulate quantum mechanics to feed themselves, because so little energy heads to them that if they didn't like kind of overcome a random walk of classical physics, they would die. And so it's always funny to me that we don't relate quantum physics to how we think and the fundamentals of life.
Right, and I think that there's another better, because you can talk about like bacteria at the bottom of the ocean in an extremely inhospitable environment using quantum mechanics, and okay, but I think what's even cooler is the fact that when you look into quantum biology, one of the things that they talk about is the fact that the color green at 70 degrees produces quantum effects when exposed to sunlight. And it's like you don't even have to get into the exact biology of photosynthesis. It's just light on the color green when it's 70 degrees out has this effect of moving the light through the leaves in such a way that it can convert it into a different type of energy through this action of entanglement. And so yeah, it's everywhere. There's a lot of evidence that we use quantum mechanics in our sense of smell, which directly connects to our prefrontal cortex. That you can take a smelly, volatile organic compound, and you can remove a hydrogen atom and replace it with deuterium. So a heavier version of a hydrogen atom that's the same shape. So you have the same shaped molecule with a different atomic weight, and you give these two substances to a person to smell, and they smell completely different. Because our cognition is acting at a scale that's below the atomic scale, and our cognition is receptive to things that are below the scale of individual atoms. And so it's existing in this realm of the quantum. And I find that so beautiful. So this is the Two-Slit Experiment, which is something that was explored a lot by a guy named Huygens, who was pretty close before Swedenborg. And there's this whole kind of, is light a particle or a wave thing. And that's not quite what I'm talking about, but what I want to talk about is how when you look at the human skull, what you see are two windows and an empty room. And so the whole geometry of our skull is built to create these kinds of unified oscillatory quantum systems. Just from the very most rough anatomy, you can see that you have two sensory organs, and they come together and they unify to create a holistic vibratory field. And so this is just an image that I want you to keep in your head, because this is how light behaves in a very fundamental way. And this is a fundamental property of light, that whenever you have a darkened room they have to be exactly the right distance apart. But it doesn't require any more technology than getting the slits to be the right distance apart, and you will get this waveform interference pattern within the space. So what is spirit? Can I get someone to read this?
The spirit itself is organized into its proper organ. It is inside the nervous fiber, like the vessel in the blood, like the brain and its turning movement. It is exactly the same as the fibers and vessels of the body, the sensory organs, the muscles, the glands, and the ducts. For whichever state the cortex indicates, the same is poured out through the continuum of fibers into the whole system within the context of those same vessels and nerve fibers. There are even more additional internal causes, how one idea sticks to a specific brain state, and the ultimate limit of the potential for intense, excited cognition. This counts out the causes of melancholy.
So this is from his essay on mania in Codex 55. This is my translation. And I really want to point to this idea that there's this switch that he makes, there's this comparison between the way spirit is thought of in the theological context and the way spiritus juices, and that's the phrase that he uses, are discussed according to the brain. I want you to sit with that maybe these two things aren't so different. And that maybe what we perceive subjectively as the spirit is something which is happening from the way that energy is moving through our bodies right now. Okay. Any questions until we move to the second part? Okay. Can I get someone to read just the highlighted part?
The leaves of a lofty poplar do not lack nourishment, and the transmitted juice of the roots, because a syringe can find no gap whereby an injected liquor can fill fibers, which are continuous from the bottom to the very top, and even to the air, or else to the tiniest center of the seed. Okay, good. So this is from his discussion of the pituitary gland, which most people, or a lot of people know that Swedenborg was one of the first people to talk about the function of the pituitary gland, and he goes on and on about it. He writes a lot about it, and he particularly is interested in the relationship between the pituitary gland and the thalamus. And you can see, if you look at the last paragraph of this, he's very interested in the fact that the pituitary gland moves. And the pituitary gland is constantly being shifted and massaged. And what is the action that is shifting and massaging it? It is the action of speech and breath.
Oh, wow.
So this is a video of someone speaking in an fMRI, or in an MRI machine. And you can see their pituitary gland is this little dongle that's, with the mouse right here.
Oh.
That's the pituitary gland. And then this is the thalamus up here. And this person is lying flat on their back in an MRI machine, so they're not moving their body at all. They're only moving their speech. And you can see that as this person is talking normally, there's a lot of motion happening here. There's a lot of motion happening all down their medulla and into their spinal cord. And so this is just normal speech, and I wasn't able to find a GIF of someone just doing deep nasal breathing. But I want to talk to you about it, and I was able to find some great sine waves So inner breathing, if people don't know, is this thing that Swedenborg talks about all the time, and this quote is one of dozens of places where he addresses this, where he says that people of the most ancient church had this other way of breathing that made their cognition different. And you can see breathing techniques in a lot of different traditions all over the world. I'm specifically thinking about pranayama. But there is this connection between the inspiration and the spirit. So just keep this GIF in mind, because I'm about to blow your mind. Okay, so this is from a recently published paper. And you can see that this is just their description. So this is a comparison between how your brain reacts when you breathe through your mouth and when you breathe through your nose. So they had a number of epileptic patients who volunteered to have electrodes put in their brains so that they could record these things from as close as possible and as direct as possible. And what you get, this column, these are all breathing through the mouth, and these are those. So the blue line is recorded from the electrodes in the cortex itself, and the red line is the line of their breath. So when you inhale through your mouth, there's not much happening, and in these three places. When you inhale through your nose, and these are all averaged out, so this isn't just one instance. This is a bunch of instances, and then they see what patterns emerge when you record it a bunch of times. Wow. This is nasal breathing. So they're recording from three parts of the brain. They're recording from the hippocampus, they're recording from the piriform cortex, and they're recording from the amygdala. And the associations we have with these areas, your hippocampus is a lot about memory encoding, but also imagination and kind of how do you structure the world, and a lot of knowledge gathering is very important. Your amygdala is an emotional center. It's all about sex and violence and anger and these big emotions, but it's also the root of your temporal lobe. Which is very important because your temporal lobes, when you have temporal lobe epilepsy, what a lot of people experience are visions of heaven, are visions of God. And an epileptic seizure isn't the brain becoming just chaotic. It's actually a state where everything becomes hyper-organized. So instead of lots of little pulsations, you get like a whoop, 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 whoop. And that's what causes the seizure, is that everything's going together. So if we want to have a way to directly access our brain's capability for the experience of the transcendent, there is something about nasal breathing which directly entrains these very fundamental pieces of our anatomy in order to put us into what is essentially a psychedelic state. And this is all over lots and lots of cultures. And thank you for, I went and emailed a lot of these professors, and I'm trying to be as good as possible about getting all the rights for these images, so I'm very grateful for all of the researchers who have helped me out with this. All right, so these are the areas that we're talking about, is this kind of inner curve of the temporal lobe, which is like this area right here. Okay, so tremulations, and talking about brainwaves. And there is something called a resting state network, which is kind of, if you look at the whole brain, you can say, well, what's kind of the resting, what's the basic kind of vibration that we're getting out of it? And as you go from completely asleep through completely awake, they're going to, these wavelengths are going to shorten and speed up. And this is something that, you know, is like late 19th century type of thing. So this isn't, you know, this isn't too big of a discovery. But there is something really important that's recently come to light about this. So I want to bring you back to this image, that the brain is an oscillator. And just hold this in your mind as we go to talk about the connectome. Can I get someone to read this? Anyone?
Functional connectome geometry. The diffused sensations should be conceived of as winding through the whole cerebrum in a spiral manner, as it were, or in accordance with the form of the winding of the convolutions, or of the cortical substances, and pure sensations as winding through the cortical gland in a vortical manner, consequently in accordance with the substantial form of the sensory organ itself. The flow of the convolutions of cortical glands in the cerebrum is into the form of a most perfect spiral. And since sensations touch every point of the cerebrum, that is, the whole of its fiber and the whole of its cortex, the circumvolution and whirling of sensations must be conceived as being in a like form, for then their fluxion and their propagation becomes easy.
Thank you. So this is getting back to this idea of a spiral. I know obviously like Swedenborg was dissecting brains and looking at brains and stuff, and there's not like a perfect spiral in this that I can see. So it's kind of spirally, but I'm not, it's not quite obvious from the basic anatomy what he's talking about. And just to refresh your memory, this is an algorithmic spiral. This is a phi spiral, so a golden ratio spiral. So you can go inward and inward and inward as a fractal, moving to smaller and smaller degrees. And so what he's talking about is how the energy of the brain, how the anima moves through the cortical fibers out into the edges, and how those layers are arranged, and how that energy moves. And this is something that modern scientists are very, very interested in. So these are connectome field harmonics. And I couldn't find a video of this, which is a little bit annoying, but you can get your heads around it. So basically, we have modes. So you put vibrations into a substance, and it's going to vibrate according to certain patterns. And they've had, for a long time, they've had ways of looking at the cortical surface. So this is an fMRI, and they've had ways of looking at the cortical fibers. So this is white matter tractography. And it's 2 o'clock, so I think we'll be able to finish up in the next half an hour. What we're looking at is basically a way of taking the brain and making it work like this. And these are cymatics. And this is something that was, my text isn't showing up. So this is something that became really popular kind of post-Swedenborg, but it's something that he would have had some idea of how this worked, and certainly the whole idea of tremulations involves this kind of geometry. So what this research is saying is that you can apply the same cymatic geometry that you get from vibrating a plate to the activity of the brain. And I just find this incredibly beautiful, and it actually, Alan Turing was one of the people who came up with this math, and he was interested in how you can take the structure of a protein and put it into a computer in such a way that you can get out the other end patterns on animal codes. And the same kind of math is the type of math that they're doing to get these connectome patterns. So what we have now is a unified way of thinking about how the brain organizes itself, which is not something that we've really had, and which is kind of a new idea. And I just sit with this and think of all of the imagery that we get throughout history of these kinds of patterns being associated with our brain space. You can think of the 1,000-petaled lotus of the mind. You can think about the golden flower in Chinese philosophy, but also the garden of the conjungal. And I think these patterns have a place in our unconscious. And have a place in our somatic awareness that is very important to pay attention to. And the knowledge that this is physiologically how our consciousness is working makes that whole statement about the parallel between the cosmic scale, the cosmic degree, and the personal degree, and the microscopic degree, and the quantum degree a lot more cohesive for me. So I just wanted to share this research with you because I think it really confirms a lot of what Swedenborg is saying. And okay, so the way that we visualize this kind of organization is through this image called a connectogram. And this is the last thing that I want to talk about, which is about why do we organize information this way? Why do we immediately go into this kind of radial geometry when we make letters, when we make images. And I think it has something to do with how our visual cortex works. And if we go back to this idea of the brain as distinctive areas which are receptive to universal modes, we can think about our interoception and our visual interoception as a window into the rest of the brain. And so this whole history of mandalas takes on a new kind of spirit when I'm thinking about things like this. And what these are, it's mathematically modeled hallucinations. Thanks to Freiberger and Besloff, who were very kind to let me use these. These are computer-generated examples of how visual cortex reacts to different kinds of hallucinogenics. But it's also the way that the visual cortex sees itself and sees the rest of the brain. So I want to encourage you to work on this project that I've given you and really see this as a way that you are using your visual cortex and your abstract visualization to get into the center of your consciousness and to get into a very fundamental level of reality. And I have a few more images, but I want to bring up this Carl Jung quote. Does someone want to read this?
My mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which was presented to me anew each day. I guarded them like precious pearls. It became increasingly plain to me that the mandala is the center. It is the exponent of all paths. It is the path to the center, to individuation.
Thank you. And so this imagery shows up everywhere. And this is the Star of Ishtar and two guardian spirits from an Assyrian tomb, a Sumerian tomb. This is the vision of the angelic hierarchy from Hildegard of Bingen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is a tantric mandala from Tibet. This is a visionary painting from Hilma af Klint. and this is one of mine, and I just wanted to close with this quotation. Therefore, you have only to make the light circulate. That is the deepest and most wonderful secret. The light is easy to move, but difficult to fix. If it is allowed to go long enough in a circle, then it crystallizes itself, and that is the natural spirit body. These are the works that I've cited, and I just wanted to leave you with, this is my Patreon, and if anyone's interested in supporting my work and supporting what I do and what I'm studying, I really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Wow. Does anyone have any questions? We still have some time.
Yeah. Wow. I think I was writing something when you explained what Codex 50. It's a place in Swedenborg.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's the Venice Manuscript, which is what we normally see, which is the big kind of teal book that the Swedenborg Scientific Association publishes. And that one was written in 1738 while Swedenborg was studying in Venice. And it probably has a lot of his notes from when he was in Paris. These are things are a little bit shaky to get exact dates on. And then, so that's like 1738 to 1740. 5 years later, in like 1743 to 45, what he does is he takes all the anatomical stuff, a lot of which had been actually taken from his contemporaries and is just straight quotations, and he reuses the straight anatomy, and he rewrites all of what he calls inductions, which is basically his theoretical stuff, which is where it gets really interesting. And so all of those places where it's been rewritten, you can get, it's kind of like one's called the brain and one's called the cerebrum, but Toffel did a translation of the second manuscript, only got about halfway through it, and kind of, he ended up mixing a lot of his contemporary stuff with Swedenborg without kind of citing which was which. So it's a little bit difficult to work with. And then, of course, he never got to the last part. So this is the last volume of Codex 55, which E.E. Unrich went through and did a translation of, and that's what this is. And this is just one of 3 volumes, but this is the one that's never been published. And it's fascinating. And it has all of this psychoanalytical stuff that's in it, and like the essay on mania, which I have the quote from, he starts out with this incredible description of a manic episode, and then goes into how he thinks that a state of hypervigilance causes an autoimmune inflammatory response in the sensory cortex and the medulla, which creates this kind of biofeedback mechanism, which it creates a biofeedback mechanism which keeps the manic energy going. And a lot of that stuff about inflammation is stuff that's backed up. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
Remember when those students in Japan, not students, but I think young people in Japan were watching movies that had like strobe-like effects and they started to have seizures?
Yeah.
Because your earlier reference made me think of that. It's kind of interesting too because in some of the alternative medicine in dealing with brain cancers and gliomas, there's an area of interest in the use of frankincense because it crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
It also has the name of Boswellia.
Yeah.
You know, if you wreck your head when you're biking, that helps to reduce the inflammation in the brain.
Yeah. There's also another thing along those lines that's really cool is One of the treatments that there is kind of an experimental treatment for Alzheimer's now is taking infrared lights and putting infrared lights up your nose and shining them directly on the olfactory bulbs. And because your brain is a light conductor, your brain is an energy conductor, there are ways of manipulating it and bringing back kind of health and plasticity just from the use of light.
Wow.
And you know, if you have a completely shifted schedule where you're awake at night and asleep during the day, your GABA producing neurons, so your inhibitory neurons, or rather you have serotonin neurons and GABA neurons, and your serotonin neurons wake you up and your GABA neurons push you down and inhibit. And if you are not awake during daylight hours enough, your serotonin neurons will turn into GABA producing neurons. So we are light conductors. And then there's there was a really cool recent article that found significant amounts of DMT internally produced in the mouse visual cortex. And this has been something that's been really controversial for a long time because it decays so quickly that you can't find it in the cerebrospinal fluid. But now they do know that our visual cortex produces DMT, which is awesome.
Could you tell us more about DMT?
So dimethyltryptamine is a compound which is a very powerful hallucinogenic when it's concentrated, and it creates a lot of different types of experiences. But it's kind of the central thing is the flash. And this stuff shows up in all plant life and a lot of mushrooms, and it turns out in the mammalian cortex as well. And it's a light conductor. So there's and one of the really interesting things on the study is that when it spikes is when you have cardiac arrest. So there's some connection between when the heart stops and when this stuff gets produced in the brain, and when this light conducting chemical gets produced in the brain when the heart stops.
Could I also add DMT is often called the spirit molecule and is in ayahuasca and the Amazon rainforest.
It's active in ayahuasca and magic mushrooms.
Ayahuasca means spirit,
but I also think that it's something that we can train ourselves to produce androgynously.
Tell us about that.
Well, I think that there is something about something about this connection between the heart and the lungs. And that when we so there's this phenomenon called photism, which is the experience of internal light. And this, The Secret of the Golden Flower, is from a manuscript. There's a medieval Chinese manuscript that talks about this phenomenon. This is something that I've experienced all my life and have been very curious about all of my life. And so, I'm just putting together this idea of that there is this chemical which gets triggered during moments of cardiac arrest that shows up, and then we also have this tradition of internal light and of fostering internal light. And I think how you train yourself is by noticing it, because all synesthesia, all sense blending gets stronger the more you pay attention to it. And so if this is a function of the brain and something that the brain naturally does, that means it's also something that we can train ourselves to do better. And so I'd say that focusing on your internal light is something that's very, very powerful and very important to do, but also the connection between your internal breath and your internal vision is all really important and is a transcendental path.
What's the word you use to describe the kind of inner seeing or inner knowing?
Photism.
There's a different word you use.
There is a different word.
At the very beginning, when you were describing what we were going to be doing here, this is a word you used.
Interoception?
Interoception.
Yeah. So there's kind of the normal five senses, and then and this is the way that Swedenborg talks about it, is like there's the normal five senses that are the external senses, and then there's the interoceptive sense, which is a sense in its own right, but it's kind of, it works a little bit differently because it's really about moving through our bodies and moving through the energy within our bodies to get to what I think is a more fundamental, direct level of reality. And I think that has something to do with this association with light. But the interoceptive sense is very important, and I think it's something that is underemphasized in our culture. So I'm on a personal mission to teach people to refine their interoception. And I hope that's something that you've been able to do today. And I really hope that you take these with you because it's great, and I'm happy to get people to do them. And two more, and then I'm going to try and wrap up.
Yeah. So up here, the light is easy to move, but difficult to fix. What do you mean by fix? Why would you fix the light? What do you mean?
So how does light move?
Well,
How fast does light go?
Speaking of light.
Light goes so fast that it doesn't move at all.
Whoa. Light goes so fast it doesn't move at all.
Yeah, and I really think that that's what it's talking about. That when you get your consciousness on that light level, you are on a quantum level, which means you're not in time and space.
Right. Yeah.
So moving is not moving, and effort is non-effort, and it all just kind of happens. And isn't that great?
Yeah.
And we have one more.
It's kind of interesting because Dr. Eric Braverman sees that people who have had traumatic brain injuries like strokes, accidents, that sort of thing, they can't grow new brain cells unless they have new hormones like bioidentical hormones. And there's a Dr. Mark Gordon in California that does a lot of work with first responders, military folks that have had traumatic brain injuries. But kind of just a digression from that is now for people who are their depression meds don't work, they're using ketamine, which back in the 70s you would have called, what, PCP and angel dust? But see, that's a resurgence for people who are really hardcore depressed and can't respond to anything else. And it was just approved in March of this year by the FDA.
Yeah, and I live near Oakland, which just decriminalized a lot of plant psychedelics. And I think that there are things which people have used, for centuries in specific ways, and I think that just not even considering them is a huge mistake on our part. And even Swedenborg talks about in the diary, he talks about the Sami shamans and how the shamans of the Sami see flashes of light during their rituals. And they, of course, use amantia mushrooms in their rituals. So, Swedenborg knew about this stuff, and we don't have any record that he actively participated, but he did know that there are how different compounds affect the brain. So just put that little nodule in your head that he was very much aware of kind of earth-based religions and earth-based medicine. Anything else? All right.
Thank you.
And there's the sphenoidal sinus.
That was a fascinating image.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
The
Which
person
one?
talking.
Yeah, Swedenborg was pineal, right?
Swedenborg's pituitary, Descartes' pineal.
Oh.
And one of the interesting things is Descartes thought that your ventricles, which are this empty space, right in here, were filled with air, which is why they're historically called ventricles. Same thing, arteries are also, it's an air word. Because when you look at a corpse, when you look at a cadaver, these things will empty.
Right.
And so Swedenborg was really, really interested in the cerebrospinal fluid and how the cerebrospinal fluid moved. And he has this whole thing about the spirits of the cerebrospinal fluid and how they move to get access to the brain. And there's this whole kind of allegory about spirits in the world of spirits, spirits in the world of spirits, and how they get into heaven. And that the brain is heaven, and the cerebrospinal place and the cerebrospinal flow
Is how they get to their spot, their love.
Is kind of the in-between space.
Oh my, yeah.
Isn't that nice?
I love that.
I love it. Yeah,
Oh.
and that's all that the 4,000s of the Arcana, which is great. And that's kind of where he does a really good job of tying together the neuroscience and the spirituality. So I really recommend people look at that part in particular, and also
Which one now? What did you say?
The 4,000.
Yeah, it's in the handout. That
It
first,
is.
that
Thank you for
first
that,
thing.
by the way.
Yeah.
Well, you were
A
saying
lot of hard work.
Well, you were saying
Yeah.
about the different communities, like taking on the whole, like what they could take on from the whole brain.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like Swedenborg's description of the angelic communities.
Yeah.
Because they're
right.
sharing, right?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Right.
Yeah, and there's this whole idea of mirroring, that we
Mirroring.
we actively construct ourselves from the people around us.
Yep.
And
Right.
we actively construct our psyche from the feedback that we get from other people. So our spiritual community is really, really important
Yep.
to our cognition and to our sanity.
Yeah.
I had heard that you can activate the pineal gland. One of the ways you can activate the pineal gland is through meditation.
Yeah.
Because, and also being in a dark room at night sleeping.
Yeah, very dark.
Very, very
Yeah.
dark.
Yeah.
Very dark.
Because it produces serotonin and melatonin.
Right.
So like I was saying with the thing with GABA versus serotonin producing neurons,
Right.
and how having a sleep cycle where you're awake in the night too much, it's your pineal gland are where these neurons primarily are, and where you're getting melatonin and serotonin. And so there's a lot of kind of discourse that's trying to make it this mystical, this other kind of thing, that there's something special about it. And I really, that's this very Cartesian idea.
Right.
And I want to really impress upon people that
There's more science to
it's
it.
the whole brain. There's
Yeah,
more
the whole
science to it, but it's the brain as part of the body as a whole living system. And
Yeah.
we think with our bodies, and in a lot of ways
Well said.
we think with our bodies, and then our brain is reacting in this kind of feedback loop. So there's a lot of cool research out there.
I've got a note here that sends you the passage from Conjugal Love about the garden gates, because it's a description of the circular motion and the fractal increase at every time you go through a gate. It's really wonderful, because it's really just a story about couples sitting in a grassy garden with these gates, but it's something much more.
And I really think that appreciation of allegory is really, really important, because what I think he realizes when he is studying is studying this kind of breath motion and this connection between breath and cognition, that the stories that we have from our culture, including the Bible, especially the Bible in his case, but any stories that we have from our culture are mechanisms that our culture has given us, passed down over years and years and years, of ways to make our brains work better.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
Wow.
are you familiar with vortex math?
Yes.
Okay, it's wonderful for this stuff.
Yes.
You mentioned how brains change based on the shape of the body
Yeah.
of the animal.
Yeah.
And you said you might talk a little more about that. Could you say something about that?
I did, but
Or maybe I missed it.
so there's
That's the spiral. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad I recognized something.
yeah. So just the one really interesting thing is this idea about bird brains. So birds have to keep their bodies very light, so they have like hollow bones. And one of the other things that they do to keep their bodies light is they don't have this heavy, fatty associative cortex, which is the outer layer of the human brain, which we use for language. And so there's, but at the same time, birds are very smart. Like ravens can speak and figure out puzzles and all of these things. So the idea is that a more associative, syntactical, linguistic type of thinking requires this heavy outer cortex. But a more kind of direct, internal, spiritual way of thinking is more of a centrally oriented
Angelic
cortex.
light being,
Yeah,
flying,
right.
elevated.
So we think about how he talks about birds having a correspondence to spiritual thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, those are thoughts which radiate around our internals.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
And I tell you, there's been nothing more that is so instructive about keeping your thoughts and associates in a high degree of elevation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to get
Well, thank you so much for everything.
Yay.